My name is Dr. Harold Isaacs. There might be some people in here that don't know me. It's very possible. I see some new faces. But I'm Professor Emeritus of History here at Georgia Southwestern. I taught 40 years full time and then retired, supposedly retired, in 2005. But I'm still working part-time. I'm third world, as one of my good friends here in the front row calls it. There are some people I would like to introduce. Just first, our speakers, John Hickman from Berry College, is going to talk about Africa, and Chaitram Singh is going to be our first speaker at Berry College, and Bill Head is United States Air Force historian at Warner Robins, and Gary Klein is our department head, and all these gentlemen have been active in Association Third World Studies, which is the main organization for Third World Studies in the United States. And Kathy Zach here in the front row is, and Paul Zach's her husband. Paul used to work at it, Planes of Secret Service, and Kathy is our editorial assistant. So she gets the Journal of Third World Studies ready for the printer. We work together on that. She's been doing that 22 years or so. This series, this Third World in Perspective program series celebrating 30th anniversary. Goes back 1981, February, not February 23rd. Because he wrote a book, the February 23rd Coup, a novel, which maybe he'll say something about. But February 18th, 1981, we had a seminar in the Roney Building. And it was major developments in Asia and the Middle East and Central America, because Central America was a hot topic, back in 81. President Reagan came in and everything. And then so we continue it. I don't know how many we've had, 130, 135, 30 years. But that grew into the Association Third World Studies, which I referred to, which is a world organization, global. And in fact, we're holding our 29th meeting in Brazil, November 20th to 23rd. That's hard to believe, it's just next month. And Salvador da Bahia, Brazil, which is northeast Brazil. And so that's, and then the 30th meeting is going to be at Berry College up in Rome, Georgia. And these gentlemen are going to be the leaders as far as organizing that is concerned, making arrangements, local arrangements, so forth. So we're proud it's going to be there. And then we also have the journal I mentioned, but that's all on the brochures, and you can go on the internet and read about this too. Just type in Third World Studies, and you'll come up with Association Third World Studies. Journal of Third World Studies. You think there'd be more on Third World Studies, since it involves 3/4 of the world. Anyhow, we're trying to increase sensitivity, to third world problems, issues, peoples, so forth. And so our first speaker, I'm talking about contemporary South Asia and Africa. Chaitram, Dr. Singh, who has been associated with the Association Third World Studies for 20 years. He was, I believe, our first secretary under the Constitution, which in fact Bill Head did the rough draft on. And we had a small constitutional convention, but we made it an institution. In other words, with the Constitution, so it would be permanent, not just a bunch of people meeting together every year and have officers and so forth, so I wouldn't have to do so much work. But Chatram is a distinguished scholar. He is Gum Professor of Government International Studies at International Politics at Berry College. He received his B.S. degree from West Point, from the United States Military Academy, an M.A. in Latin American Studies from University of Florida. They have a great program there. Terry McCoy is, well, I don't know if he was he wasn't director back then, I think.
Yes.
Was he? Because I know Helen, yeah. And his PhD in political science from the University of Florida. Chatram is a native of Guyana, and he served in various departments of that government: labor, education, foreign affairs. He was a second lieutenant in the Guyana Defense Force. He's author of 5 books, two of which are novels. And the latest one is The February 23rd Coup, which is a novel on a coup in Guyana and Suriname. And he also wrote another novel about the military in Guyana. It was the Flower Convoy. And then he's written books, scholarly books on Guyana and Trinidad. And he's got also a book out, Instructor's Manual on World Politics. And has written a lot of articles, including for the Journal of Third World Studies, and presented papers at numerous professional meetings. He's also the associate editor of the Latin American sections of the Journal of Third World Studies. So I work with Chatram, and he's an excellent scholar. It's a pleasure to work with him. I'm glad he's taken the position. He's also editor of the newsletter of our association, and it's never been better. I mean, he's a great photographer and writer. And if you go to our website, just type in ATWS and look at the most recent issue. And in fact, there were 2 issues, one on the meeting in Savannah and then just a general issue, and you'll see all the information there. And that's how we communicate through our website. So without further delay, I want to say it's really an honor to have you here. Finally, we talked about this in the, if I remember correctly, it was Kennedy Airport. John and you and I, we talked about the Third World Series, and I said, well, why don't you all come down sometime? So finally, we arranged it. And what Chatram is talking about is major problems and issues in contemporary South Asia. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Chatram Singh to Georgia Southwestern State University.
Well, thank you, Harold. It's good to see you again, Bill Head. And actually quite a treat to renew my friendship with Dr. Gary Klein. I've known him through the Association of Third World Studies, a terrific colleague and a really great guy all around, and it's good to see him again. The last time I was here, I was part of a panel on Latin America, but that was a long time ago, and the world had changed significantly. After September 11, 2001, I began reading up in Pakistan, and after I had logged about 100 reading hours, I decided to put some things in writing, and so I made a few conference papers and had some publications. I mention that because in looking at South Asia today, to oversimplify things a bit, India is focused on China. China is focused on the emerging axis between India and the United States. Pakistan is focused on India and on Afghanistan, and it's a confusing mix, but Pakistan is playing the role of the spoiler. I think you've figured that out from the news, and so much of what I have to say today will focus on Pakistan. A few years ago, Newsweek identified Pakistan as the most dangerous country in the world. In fact, Benazir Bhutto, former Prime Minister of Pakistan, who was assassinated in December of 2007, in her book Reconciliation, describes Pakistan as a powder keg. Now, very briefly, Pakistan is broken down into 4 provinces. They're listed up there: the Punjab, what used to be called the Northwest Frontier Province, Baluchistan, Sindh, and then you have 2 areas, the federally administered tribal areas, which is sort of a no man's land, and that's where segments of the Taliban is operating and the Haqqani network. And then 2 other areas, the northern areas and a portion of the Kashmir region. And this is Pakistan here in the map, but I just wanted to point out the federally administered tribal areas, this portion here, and that's the region where you have quite a bit of what we would call terrorist activities involving the Haqqani network and the Taliban. Ethnicity is very important in this part of the world. If you look at the breakdown of Pakistan in terms of ethnicity, plurality, about 44% are Punjabi, and the next larger percentage is the Pashtuns. This one is very critical because the Taliban operating in Afghanistan is Pashtun. And the ethnic allegiances, the tribal allegiances are very strong, which is why the United States has had problems with Pakistan, because the Pashtuns account for about 20% of the military. And they're also present in the intelligence services. And so many of these have loyalties to the Taliban on the other side of the border. And so once they get wind of some U.S. operation against the Taliban, the word gets out there and they just disappear. But ethnic affiliations are very important. Let me just make mention of an utterance by one of the Pashtun leaders of Pakistan way back in the 1980s. His name was Abdul Wali Khan. He said that he had been a Pashtun for 3,000 years, a Muslim for 1,300, and a Pakistani for only 47 years. So you can guess where his allegiances lay. And so you want to keep that in mind because it does explain some of the difficulties we're experiencing with Pakistan. Pakistan is an ideological state, and that ideology rests on religious nationalism. Islam was the basis of its creation because it was created out of India, and what they did was they pulled aside those states that were predominantly Muslim to form West Pakistan and East Pakistan. It is called the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. Islam is the state religion. You have to be a Muslim to be, even though there are minorities, there are Christians, Hindus, you have to be a Muslim to be prime minister in that particular country. They do have Islamic parties. They don't do very well in elections, but they're easily mobilizable, and they've been used for a variety of purposes. Jamaat-e-Islami, or the Islamic Party, embraces Sharia law. They're very anti-Western. So is the Jamiat Ulema-e-Islam. They are very conservative Muslims who believe would like to expunge Islam of any Western influences and go back to the old days when Muhammad was around. They've taken this very seriously during the between 1977 and 1988, when the military governed under General Zia-ul-Haq. He embarked on what was called an Islamization program, an extended period of time in which new recruits into the military were expected to be good Muslims, and then of course in an Islamic country you'd expect people as well to follow Islam. The generals have not. There's a certain degree of hypocrisy in Pakistan with regards to the use of Islam. In fact, it's very cynical use of Islam. Most of the generals in the Pakistani army are heavy drinkers. And, you can't drink alcohol and be a good Muslim, and yet they, bandy about this idea that Pakistan is this champion of Islam, when in reality it's simply used to mobilize people for purposes that they might have in mind. Also, part of this ideology that Pakistan embraces is a hostility to India, and they see India as an existential threat to Pakistan. And it's not simply over the issue of Kashmir. The very fact that Pakistan exists as a Muslim state with sharp ethnic divisions, it needs an external enemy to provide some degree of cohesion. And India seems India does part of that, Israel does that, the United States as well. These are all seen by elements of the religious community in Pakistan as existential threats to Pakistan. But this hostility to India as well is fed by the military because it serves their interest. As long as there is this enemy next door, large budgets will be allocated to the military, so they will have a large military. And over time, it has led to military dominance of the entire country. Pakistan was created in 1947, and just at the time it was created, the state of Kashmir acceded to India. There was a war between the two countries, and the military was able, at the time they signed a peace agreement, they were able to capture a portion of Kashmir. So they kept that within the Pakistani state. Also, the Northwest Frontier Province, which is predominantly Pashtun, wanted to join with the Pashtuns in Afghanistan to establish a state called Pashtunistan. So which would have meant that province would have broken away from Pakistan. And in Baluchistan as well. These people are Baluchis, and they did not want to be part of Pakistan. So the military entered in both of these areas and kept the country together. As a result of all of these, they were regarded by the civilians, and they regarded themselves as saviors of the Pakistani state because they were able to keep the country together. But the Pakistani politics have been in disarray. Its founding leader died within a year of independence, and apart from the fact that they had advocated a Muslim state, there was no economic or political blueprint for this country, and so they were just, in the wilderness. In 1958, on October 7th, as a matter of fact, martial law was declared because the country was in deep debt. Economic affairs were in disarray. In East Pakistan, there had been hand-to-hand combat in the legislature, leading to the deputy speaker being killed. So in those circumstances, the military took over. And under General Ayub Khan, they governed from 1958 until 1971. And during this particular time, political parties were sidelined. And you see this pattern here that political parties would be deinstitutionalized in Pakistan. They are weak. They're like private enterprises. In 1977, there was another coup, but brought General Zia-ul-Haq, and he was the one I mentioned who had started this Islamization program. And again, political parties were sidelined. In 1999, there was a military coup. General Pervez Musharraf, whose name should be fairly familiar to you, he was removed from power in 2008. But during his rule, political leaders of the main political parties were in exile. And here again, you see, this pattern of deinstitutionalization of political parties. And the net result of that is that the military dominates the entire system. The military in Pakistan is the paramount institution in that country. Now, as a result of these long periods of military rule, the military has acquired some corporate or organizational interests far beyond those that you would associate with the military. The more conventional interests are these, that they would like to have a decent share of the budget, or at least their budget maintained, that the political leaders should not interfere with their autonomy, military affairs, how you recruit new officers or soldiers, how you train them, who gets promoted, at least in the lower ranks, not counting generals, and that they should have the exclusive right to bear arms in the national defense. So they feel threatened if you have some paramilitary organization that would challenge their exclusive right to bear arms. In the case of Pakistan, there are some additional interests. The Pakistani economy. And the reason for that is that Pakistan, the military has these welfare organizations. In the Army, you have the Army Welfare Trust and the Fauji Foundation. The Air Force has the Shaheen Foundation, and the Navy has the Baharia Foundation. And they have enormous business interests, from serial manufacturing to road construction and to cement factories, etc. So they have a stake in the economy. And these interests report directly to the Chief of Army Staff. So here again, the Pakistani military has interposed itself into the management of the economy. In foreign policy, starting in the 1950s, the military, to acquire Western arms, in fact, interposed itself in foreign affairs, and they were trying to conduct their private foreign policy with the United States to get weaponry. But insofar as foreign affairs are concerned, they're especially focused on India and on Afghanistan, and a civilian government that acts contrary to what the Pakistani military would like is likely to run afoul of the military, and that is precisely what happened in 1999. The government of Nawaz Sharif was engaged in rapprochement with the Indians over Kashmir to settle the matter peacefully, because the civilians recognize that unless you do that, a disproportionate amount of the national budget will go to the military. Education and other aspects of social welfare would be neglected, and so the educational system would be taken over by these madrasas funded by Saudi Arabia, etc. And what they'll be doing is teaching this very fundamentalist Islam. And these madrasas would become channeling routes for future terrorists. Also, the Pakistani military would like to see a managed democracy in Pakistan, which is to say that you have some civilian figureheads there, as long as it is the military that has the major say. Now, following the elections of 2008, there is a civilian president and a civilian prime minister, and it is an interest of the United States that these people last out their elected term, because it would mean it's an essential step in order to get civilian rule entrenched. But there is no question that they are governing that the military is the ones who have the final say. And so you have the Army Chief of Staff, General Ashfaq Kayani. He's really, I would say, primus inter pares here, the first among equals. It is primarily a volunteer military, but notice that this is a land-based army, but 550,000 people in the Army, smaller Air Force and smaller Navy. The breakdown insofar as ethnicity, 75% Punjabi, 20% Pashtun in the northwest frontier province, and that's the group to keep an eye out. Now, here's this organization you've heard a lot about. Each of the branches of the military has an intelligence service. So the Air Force has one, the Navy has one, and the Army has one. These are now coordinated in an organization called the ISI, the Inter-Services Intelligence. That's how you get that term. But because it's the Army that predominates in the military organization in Pakistan, the ISI is headed by a lieutenant general from the Army and reports directly to the Chief of Army Staff. They conduct military intelligence. They do domestic surveillance. Prime Minister Bhutto in the 1970s and Prime Minister Bhutto, the daughter, complained that in fact ISI would spy on them. So they spy on all of these people, that, even though they provide information to them as well. They are engaged in foreign intelligence and foreign operations, but critical to our consideration here is that they are also associated with terrorist organizations, with Al-Qaeda, with Lashkar-e-Taiba, Army of the Pure, Jaish-e-Mohammed, Army of Mohammed. These two organizations were created really to fight, conduct guerrilla warfare against India in the Kashmir region. But as I will point out that, Al-Qaeda's bin Laden was also involved in the setting up of these organizations. You should also know that Al-Qaeda is a Sunni Muslim organization. The Taliban is Sunni Muslim. And most of these folks that we're talking about here are Sunni Muslim. Pakistan is predominantly Sunni Muslim. Sipahi Sahaba, friends of the Prophet, they're very anti-Shia, and if you've been looking at the news, they've been conducting operations killing Shias in Pakistan. Lashkar-e-Jhangvi broke away from Sipahi Sahaba, and they're doing the same thing, killing Shias as well. And then you have the Haqqani network. Now, Pakistan is both a sponsor of terrorism, witness the ISI's association with those terrorist organizations that it helped to create. And Pakistan has also cooperated with the United States on some aspects of terrorism. And that was done especially under the presidency of Pervez Musharraf between 2001 2008. In fact, he was pressured to do that. At the time of the attacks of September 11, 2001, the head of the ISI was actually in Washington, and he was summoned by the Deputy Secretary of State, Richard Armitage, who asked him to communicate to his government that if Pakistan did not withdraw its support from the Taliban, the US would in fact bomb them back to the Stone Age. And very quickly, General Musharraf withdrew 60,000 troops from Afghanistan, which helped, of course, to bring down the Taliban regime. But it is interesting that once he made that decision, the head of the ISI, who had disagreed with it, because here's a 3-star general, resigned. So it tells you that government has been divided. And the government maintains contact with these terrorist organizations. To look back at bin Laden, he arrived in Pakistan in 1980. He was organizing aid money from the Middle East to the Mujahideen who were fighting against the Soviet Union. And he developed a close working relationship with the ISI, the Inter-Services Intelligence. In fact, it was bin Laden and the ISI who set up Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed. First to fight in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, and then in Kashmir. And the ISI facilitated bin Laden's connections as well with the Taliban when bin Laden returned to that area in 1996. Now, here's how they've operated. After the Taliban regime fell in Afghanistan in 2001, the Taliban leadership fled to Pakistan, as did the Al-Qaeda leadership. So the United States armed forces are present in Afghanistan. They're pushing the Taliban to the southeast. The Pakistani army, under orders from General Musharraf, was pushing northwest. So they had Al-Qaeda and the Taliban sandwiched. And then what happened was on December 13, 2001, 5 members of Jaish-e-Mohammed attacked the Indian parliament while it was in session and killed several of those people. Well, the Indians, were really mad. I mean, that's the heart of their democracy, and they moved troops to the Pakistani border. And what happened? Pakistan withdrew its troops from fighting Al-Qaeda and the Taliban to face the Indian army, who benefited Al-Qaeda. They were able to escape. So these organizations moved together, and that is very, very important to note. Bruce Riedel, who was a CIA officer for some 20-odd years and who worked with the Clinton administration, said that, in fact, Al-Qaeda swims in a sea of jihadist groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, Sipahi Sahaba, etc. And these organizations were created by the ISI to fight against Afghanistan and increase Pakistani influence there, to fight India in the Kashmir region. Well, you have to add these others as well. The Haqqani network that you've been hearing about, and Lashkar-e Jangvi. It's interesting the game the Pakistanis play. In 1999, President Clinton asked General Musharraf to ban Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed, and Musharraf refused. He said that those were not terrorist organizations, they were nationalist organizations fighting for the liberation of Kashmir. And yet here you have this association among Al-Qaeda and these other two terrorist organizations. One of the, if you've been looking at the news, the organization that was involved in the attack on the U.S. Embassy in Afghanistan last month was the Haqqani Network. The old man who was active during the Afghan war against the Soviet Union has now passed on leadership to his two sons, Sirajuddin Haqqani and Badruddin Haqqani. And this organization here, they're a sub-tribe of the Pashtuns. They have ties to the ISI dating back to the Soviet Jihad. They had a close relationship with bin Laden as well. And they're operating from bases both in Afghanistan and in the north and south Waziristan area. It's in the federally administered tribal area of Pakistan that I showed you earlier. What are Al-Qaeda's goals? And they continue even though bin Laden is dead. And that's to draw the United States into bleeding wars, to bankrupt it as they did with the Soviet Union. You can argue there's some degree of success there. To go after Israel and the U.S.-friendly Arab states once the United States has retrenched from its more global involvement. And they hate Iran, and so what they would like to do is to launch a so-called false flag operation against the United States, making it appear as though he has come from Iran, so that the United States would then go after Iran. And so the two enemies of Al-Qaeda and the Sunni Muslims would be at each other's throats. And they'd be very happy to see that. But they're also interested in acquiring a nuclear weapon. They regard it as their sacred Muslim duty to do that, and bin Laden had pledged that he would use that against the United States. Which brings us to Pakistan's nuclear weapons. They have approximately 100 deployed nukes. They're under the control of the Pakistani army and not of the civilian government. They're located in the northwest of Pakistan, which made sense when they were developing these weapons because they wanted to keep them as far away from India as possible. But that is precisely where the terrorists are operating today. Now, there are some safety features that they have. They use dummy missiles to confuse anyone who might come after these missiles. And they do separate the warheads, the bombs, from the detonation devices. They require, as we do, 2 people to launch a missile. There are codes, they're called PALs, permissive action links. They do screen their personnel to making sure that they don't have, Islamic zealots in there. But what does that really mean? When under President Zia, they had actually embarked on Islamization. So, this is a Muslim country. How do you purge Muslims from working in these silos that they have? There are those risks. I mean, there are the civilian sites where these missiles go to be refurbished are not as secure. They're not as closely guarded as the military sites are. There are Islamists in the nuclear facilities that could let in people in there. And then you have these AQ Khans. I mean, these are freelancers, people who know the technology and who can travel around the globe, sharing it with all and sundry. Those are risks that we have to recognize. But then, other than that, there have been some direct attacks against these nuclear sites by suicide bombers. People are trying to get access to gain some of those, the bomb, which you can disassemble and use at least the guts of the bomb for something more crude. In November 1st, 2007, a nuclear missile storage facility at Sargod was attacked. December 2007, a nuclear air base at Kamra, and August 20, 2008, you had the armaments complex in the Waq cantonment of Pakistan was also attacked. What are Pakistan's goals in Afghanistan? Well, to determine who controls Afghanistan after the U.S. leaves, and they know now that the United States will leave, and their preference is for the Taliban, precisely the same organization that we are fighting. So on the one hand, they are cooperating with us to a certain extent, at least nominally, in the fight against the Taliban. On the other hand, they would like to see the Taliban survive because they created it and they would like the Taliban to rule. They are contradictory policies, if you hadn't recognized that, but the Pakistanis have been very clever. During the war against the Soviet Union in the 1970s, late 1970s, early 1980s, the president of Pakistan at the time, General Zia-ul-Haq, said that you have to keep Afghanistan boiling at the right temperature. So you stoke it, because that's the way American money will come in. Okay, so you can play both sides. You want to keep the conflict going because the American money will keep coming in, which is another reason why Hussein Haqqani, who is the current Pakistani ambassador to the United States, in an article he wrote for Current History, said a few years ago that the Pakistanis would never give up bin Laden. Why would they? Because as long as bin Laden is alive, it keeps the United States committed to Afghanistan and keeps U.S. money coming to them. It's interesting that finally when they located bin Laden, he was hiding next door to the Pakistani military academy. The Pakistani intelligence services can tell you how many rooms there are in a hotel in Mumbai, because they bombed the place or destroyed the place in several of those places in 2008. And if they can do that, and if they have that kind of information, why wouldn't they know that this walled place very close to the military academy was housing someone of the stature of bin Laden? And clearly they were shown to be as duplicitous as in fact most people recognize. Also, they have not forgotten that the Pashtuns on both sides of the border would like to group together, and so they would like to degrade any effort to merge their province, Northwest Frontier Province, with Afghanistan, any part of Afghanistan. So they don't want a new state created out of the Pashtun people. Thirdly, they would like to acquire through Afghanistan strategic depth against India. They're concerned about Indian influence in Afghanistan. The Indians have been helping lots of civic projects with the United States in Afghanistan. Fourth, they would like to refine what they would call asymmetric warfare against India. They know that this is a country with a good economy, but also large military. And you can hit them using terrorist methods, networks. They have done that before. I mean, one of the more dramatic ones was in fall of 2008. And then finally, the Pakistanis have recognized that our pockets have become lighter. We're a little poorer today, if you hadn't noticed. The Chinese are much richer. And so they would like to present themselves as a useful and powerful ally to any major power with deep pockets. It used to be the United States. Now it's China. And so when we apply pressure to them, they turn to the Chinese. During the attack against bin Laden, or the one that where bin Laden was killed, as you know, an American helicopter, for technical reasons, didn't make it out. And the Pakistanis allowed the Chinese to inspect that helicopter. That's the kind of service that they perform in the hope of currying favor with the Chinese. The Chinese have helped them with their nuclear weapons, their rocketry. But as you can see then from this presentation that Pakistan has been a duplicitous ally, if you would use that term ally advisedly. The potential for future difficulties with Pakistan are there. The nuclear weapons are a major concern, but their connection, this kind of symbiotic and parasitic existence they've lived as a rentier state, getting other countries to pay their bills while they associate with terrorists and do harm in their neck of the woods and potentially beyond, remains. And here I will stop and turn it over to the next person.
Well, that was excellent presentation. Our next speaker is also from Berry College, Dr. John Hickman's Associate Professor of Government at Berry, received a BS in Political Science and Sociology from Missouri State University, Juris Doctor degree from Washington University School of Law, and PhD in Comparative Politics from the University of Iowa, and teaches a lot of courses in comparative politics and also seminars. He's the author of 2 books. One's already published, Reopening the Space Frontier, 2010. And he's got another book coming out explaining Guantanamo, which is forthcoming 2012. I believe, is it 12 or 12 by University of Florida Press. And he's also has contributed a lot of op-ed pieces to newspapers and published articles and scholarly publications. Also, he has traveled extensively and done research in various countries in Asia and taught in Japan and South Korea. And he's also a faculty advisor to Young Democrats at Berry College and Amnesty International. That's really close together again. And so John also has been active in ATWS, and he's running for vice president. This time they're going to have the meeting up there next year. We're going to have our 30th annual meeting. So he's going to talk about major problems and issues in contemporary Africa. So please join me in welcoming Dr. John Hickman, Georgia Southwestern.
Thank you, guys. I'm not going to do a PowerPoint. In fact, I'm just going to talk old school, right? And what I'd like to do is some of what I will say I think will parallel some of the things, some of the issues and topics that Chaitram brought up, and also depart in important ways. My charge was to look at Africa, what's been happening in Africa over the past couple of years. And I think the single most important observation that we can make about major problems and issues in contemporary sub-Saharan Africa is that Pliny the Elder's observation, ex Africa semper aliquid novi, or out of Africa always something new, is incorrect. In fact, I think overall what we've seen over the last year or two is a continuation of almost every major problem, every major issue that Africa has seen for decades. Africa is doing the same thing with, in some ways, greater intensity. Now, as a political scientist and as a pessimist by temperament, I'm not surprised by that. It is, however, unfortunate because the continent that is sub-Saharan Africa's potential is so immense, and yet its problems are just legion. It's amazing. Now, the political pathologies that I want to talk about matter because they explain so much of I think the failure to realize the economic and social potential of sub-Saharan Africa. And my short list of problems and issues, major problems, major issues, begins with authoritarianism, moves on to ethnic and sectarian electoral mobilization, then official corruption, and then rounds out with poverty and famine, AIDS and HIV pandemic, and I think the weakness of the African Union also deserves at least mention in this list. So I'm going to start at the top and work my way down, if that's okay with you guys. Authoritarianism. One of the things that that many people I think had hoped for was that the populist uprisings that we've seen across the Arab world, the thing that we're calling the Arab Spring, would spread. I mean, a lot of those uprisings seem to be democratic, they seem to be liberal, genuinely democratic, genuinely liberal, and I think many people were hoping that we'd see that spread across sub-Saharan Africa as well. Unfortunately, that was a hope that was not realized. It was a hope that was felt outside of Africa and really across Africa itself, too. Many people were hoping to see some big change attend the big changes that we're seeing in the Arab world. Social media have been really important in the Arab world in connecting people with grievances, kind of reducing the atomization of society, reducing the atomization that's caused by repression, bringing people together, sometimes very spontaneously, to demand change in government. We see the dramatic changes in Egypt and in Tunisia peacefully, and in Libya not so peacefully. But we've seen dramatic changes also in Yemen and Syria and elsewhere. Arab governments found things like Facebook an immense challenge. The Chinese government, it didn't, in effect, because it replaced Facebook with its own social media, which seems to be the ticket. If you want to stop social media from being a threat, introduce your own social media and make people use it. You can censor social media. The Arab governments were kind of caught unawares, and they just didn't quite realize how powerful it could be, I think. So Africa is a place where you'd think that social media would have a tremendous effect. Much of Africa is connected by cell phones. It's amazing the cell phone use across Africa. It's too late to really set up landlines across much of Africa, so people have cell phones. It's the perfect technology for social media, right? And yet, we haven't really seen it bear this kind of democratic and liberal fruit. I want to give you an example of what has happened. Back in February 13th, this year, a fellow named Vikas Mavudzi, a 39-year-old resident of Bulawayo in Zimbabwe, posted the following, I think, innocuous message about the Egyptian revolution on the Facebook wall of Prime Minister Morgan Tsvangirai. Now, just a moment of background. Morgan Tsvangirai is the current prime minister of the country. Robert Mugabe is the current president. They're in a kind of unusual power-sharing arrangement. And Robert Mugabe, whose ZANU-PF government has effectively ruled Zimbabwe for a long time, has kind of contained Morgan Tsvangirai in this power-sharing agreement wherein no power is actually shared. All the power is still in the hands of Robert Mugabe. And Morgan Tsvangirai is, in a sense, kind of controlled. So anyway, Facebook page, and this fellow, Vikas Mavudzi, posts the following message. And listen it, if you would. I am overwhelmed, I don't want to say Mr. or PM, that is Prime Minister. What happened in Egypt is sending shockwaves to dictators around the world, period. No weapon but unity of purpose, worth emulating, hey. Now, I gotta tell you, for a Facebook message, that's pretty coherent. That's pretty good. I mean, you guys realize, right? And it was even spelled correctly, which is, I think, genius. The obvious kind of implication you can read into that message was that what happened to Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, overthrown by a popular uprising, could happen to Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe. So what happens? Well, the security services eventually get around to reading the Facebook wall, and then on March 9th, they arrest poor Mr. Mavudzi on a charge of advocating and attempting to subvert a constitutional government under Section 22(2)A of the Criminal Law Code, Chapter 9, subsection 23. Sounds bad for him. After all, Zimbabwe doesn't really have a great record of conducting fair trials. On June 10th, he was tried. And this is the good part. There is a little, there's a happy element to this. The case was effectively thrown out of court. And it wasn't thrown out of court because there was a mass uprising. That's the sad part. It was thrown out of court because of international outrage. Had people not been offended around the world by his treatment, had it not been picked up in the international press, God knows what would have happened to poor Mr. Mavudzi. Right? Now, on the whole, the populist anger that's reinforced, mobilized through social media against long-serving regimes has been effectively contained in sub-Saharan Africa. There are things going on. For example, if you go to Dakar in Senegal, you've got people doing protest rap against President Wade. But still, that's not an African Spring. We haven't seen a big change yet. Doesn't mean it's not going to happen. We just haven't seen much of an indication so far. Indeed, I think there may be a problem with the Arab Spring for this potential African Spring. In Libya, the most violent of these uprisings, migrant Africans have been mistreated by the people who ought to be, in a sense, taking them on as colleagues. Migrant Africans, people from places like Chad or Niger, have been mistreated, and it perhaps worse. There may have been a massacre conducted by the revolutionaries in Libya, and we're still waiting to find out what happened there. I mentioned Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, sometimes known as Comrade Bob by Zimbabweans. What he's done, of course, is effectively strangle both democracy and the economy of Zimbabwe, producing history's most extreme inflation rates, far greater than anything seen in Germany in the Weimar Republic. But it's not just Mugabe. After all, the continent that is sub-Saharan Africa is home to more authoritarian rulers than anywhere else on the planet, and certainly the largest concentration of long-serving dictators. Angola is still ruled. Angola is still ruled by President Jose Eduardo dos Santos. He's been 32 years in power. Burkina Faso still ruled by Blaise Compaoré, 23 years in power. Cameroon still ruled by Paul Biya, 28 years in power. Equatorial Guinea still ruled by Teodoro Obiang, 32 years in power. Uganda still ruled by Yoweri Museveni, 25 years in power. Although, for what it's worth, there are some indications that he is loosening, liberalizing just a bit. And finally, and I think most preposterously, poor benighted Swaziland is still ruled by King, if you'll take that title seriously, Mswati, who's been in power for 25 years. So we've got a bunch of guys here in sub-Saharan Africa who've really been in power for a very, very long time. Presidents for life, plus, of course, this fellow who calls himself king. Now, of this group, Mugabe, Robert Mugabe, gets the lion's share of the media attention. It's something of a shame. I mean, he deserves his attention, but there are others, especially Teodoro Obiang in Equatorial Guinea, who get almost no attention and yet deserve a whole lot more. Of these figures, he is in some ways my favorite. Now, Teodoro Obiang has been in power since 1979. He overthrew his uncle, who was, for what it's worth, a worse leader than himself, did more horrific things, more morally repugnant. But still, Teodoro Obiang heads one of the least responsible, one of the more repressive governments on the planet. According to the World Bank, Equatorial Guinea has a per capita GDP that places it roughly equal to South Korea or Slovenia. Now that makes it more than a medium income country, edging up into, well, almost, it's hard to call it a high income country, but it's doing fairly well. Compared to the rest of Africa, it would be, if that money was spread around equally, be doing fantastically. However, and this is the sad part, most of its people live in dire poverty. Most of the people who live in Equatorial Guinea live at a level comparable to Angola, some of the poorest people on the planet. So what's happening to all of the money that comes from, in this case, oil revenues? Well, it's ending up in bank accounts scattered all over the planet in the names of Teodoro Obiang and his extensive family and cronies. In a sense, the country's oil wealth is being looted by one ruling family. There's room for outrage here. It's okay to be outraged. This is obscene. Nepotism, of course, well, wait a minute, I should note that Teodoro Obiang did win an election. In November 2009, he won the presidency with an amazing, an impressive 95.37% of the vote. These kinds of numbers are not real in the sense they don't come out of fair processes. Okay? Now, nepotism is a natural part of this problem. Teodoro Obiang's son, Teodoran Obiang, whose salary as a government minister is $6,799 a month, was recently exposed as having used an account at Barclays Bank in London in the name of a forest company that he owns, called Samagui Forestal, to buy 18 million pounds worth of art from the estate of Yves Saint Laurent. So he's got access to some money, apparently, that he can use to go buy some impressive amounts of art. Corruption in Equatorial Guinea goes all the way down from levels like that, at the very top, to policemen at checkpoints around the country demanding tiny bribes from people who have almost no money. And indeed, we have one documented case in which they shot a man to death because he didn't hand over a small bribe just at a checkpoint. Demonstrations are banned, of course. According to human rights organizations, surveillance, arbitrary detention, and torture are not just used, they are commonplace. Some sense of how deplorable, how medieval this country is in terms of law can be gained from the fact that on June 22nd of this year, Teodoro Obiang decided that he would order the release of 22 political prisoners. For humanitarian reasons? Nope. He wanted to celebrate his own birthday. I mean, how medieval can you get? I mean, the only thing that's left after this is that if he walks around the country touching people to cure scrofula like the ancient English kings, right? And this is tragic, I think. Anyway, news coverage in the U.S. about repression in Cote d'Ivoire, Uganda, Zimbabwe over the last 2 years has been, I think, adequate. If you're reading the papers, if you're watching TV news, you've seen something at least about these countries. But there has been precious little about Equatorial Guinea. But there should have been, because in June of this year, there were mass arrests to prevent any demonstrations following that would attend the AU summit there in the country. Teodoro Obiang, despite all of these things, has been elected as chairman of the African Union, which says something about that organization, I'm afraid. In 2010, last year, he sent his secret agents to a neighboring country, well, a country farther up the coast of Africa, Benin, and they kidnapped 4 opponents, brought them back to Equatorial Guinea, held a quick trial, and shot them. This is not what you would call proper international behavior. Anyway, for what it's worth, however, UNESCO apparently will not accept the creation of the UNESCO Obiang Nguema Prize for Research in the Life Sciences. They won't let him give money to create this because his name will be on it. Well, there is at least a step in the right direction. Okay, I've given you examples, kind of anecdotal examples of tyranny in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. It'd be nice, though, to have kind of a way to compare, really, to get a bigger picture. And I think we can use the regime rankings from the Economist Intelligence Unit. The Economist is that paper in London that is sleep-inducing, if you've ever read it. However, it does produce some nice data, and you can find it online. And what they do is they rank countries as full democracies, flawed democracies, hybrid regimes, and authoritarian regimes. So yeah, rank from 1, 2, 3, 4. 1 is, of course, full democracy. At the other end of the spectrum, kind of full dictatorship. The 2010 rankings that they provide count only 1 full democracy in sub-Saharan Africa. Of all the countries, only 1, and that's Mauritius. It's a little island in the Indian Ocean. They count Benin, Botswana, Cape Verde, Ghana, Lesotho, Namibia, South Africa as flawed democracies, right? But that leaves 9 hybrid regimes and 25 fully authoritarian regimes. This is pretty deplorable stuff. Now, the good news in all this, by the way, is Chad somehow was beaten in the race to the bottom in ranking by North Korea. So the most repressive place on the planet is not in sub-Saharan Africa. It's still North Korea. Okay. Quite a lot has been said about the malign influence of China in Africa. If you've been reading the press, you've seen that there is the Chinese threat in Africa. But for what it's worth, and I think we might consult Chatram on this a bit, but for what it's worth, I think there's plenty of malign, M-A-L-I-G-N, malign Western influence in Africa still. Every one of the tyrants that I've mentioned, every one of these authoritarian regimes has good friends in Western capitals, bankers, business people, mining executives, And they also have quite a few friends among the political class. And I like scandals. Scandals are fun to watch. There's a scandal going on right now in France that involves a conservative bagman, a man named Robert Bourgui, who helped to move a great deal of cash from African capitals to Paris to pay off French President Chirac and his aide, who then became prime minister. And this occurred from 1995 to 2005. And apparently, we're talking lots of money was moved from places like Gabon to Paris. You'd think it'd go the other way, right? You know, rich country to poor country. It was moving from poor country to rich country. What was happening is that he was moving kickbacks, in fact, bribes, for certain kinds of favored treatment. The French keep troops in a number of Francophone African countries. They help support a number of regimes in their former colonies. And they've basically bought a lot of oil from these places. They care a lot. And they also sell luxury goods. At one point in the 1980s, Gabon had the highest per capita consumption of champagne on the planet. So French luxury goods and so on, right? Anyway, they also seem to help some people win elections and other people lose elections. They help Ali Bongo win election after his father died in Gabon under circumstances that can best be, can most charitably called, what's the right word? Crooked. It's the best thing you can say, right? Something was fishy about this election. What's the American connection? Well, there are lots of American connections. The strangest, the most fun, involves the relationship between the Christian right and a couple of governments in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, this last year we saw the French-backed Muslim rival in Côte d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast, Alassane Ouattara, win first an election and then a civil war against the president of that country, Laurent Gbagbo. But Laurent Gbagbo received lots of support, verbal support in the United States from the Christian right. One of my favorite figures, Robertson, Reverend Robertson, on the 700 Club, simply said that, the official election returns are just wrong. In fact, Gbagbo actually won the election, and what's more, he's a very fine man. So therefore, we should support him. Forget the election returns. Oklahoma Senator James O'Keefe, Senator James Inhofe, took time off from climate denial to lend his support to Gbagbo on the floor of the U.S. Senate. So what's going on here? Well, it seems that Gbagbo wasn't just any dictator. He was an evangelical Christian dictator, and not only that, had attended the National Prayer Breakfast in Washington. Problems like corruption and bigamy notwithstanding, he was one of their own, and therefore deserved at least verbal support. Right? Then there was the intervention of Focus on the Family and the American Center for Law and Policy, creation of Reverend Robertson, in Kenya's 2010 constitutional referendum. There they intervened to try to stop the passage of the referendum, ostensibly because of something to do with abortion and the Islamic courts provisions. But I got to tell you, I think it has to do with the connection to the Obama administration and the fact that Barack Obama's father was from Kenya and so on. It was kind of an effort to embarrass the Obama administration, which had supported passage of the referendum. Okay. All right, so that's a discussion of authoritarianism. I think I may have time yet. Still have some time? Talk about a few minutes more, okay? To talk about ethnic and
3 minutes.
How much?
3, because Bill has.
It's amazing what I can do in 3 minutes, right? Ethnic and sectarian political mobilization is really important. I think people don't get why what is called tribalism and ought to be called kind of ethnic politics is so important in Africa. It's important because ethnicity is a really simple marker. It tells you what group you belong to, and the group doesn't change. You can't enter and leave this group easily. Once you're a member of an ethnic group, you're there. And this ethnicity is really important because if your ethnic group joins a coalition, and the coalition wins through an election or through a civil war, you have a claim on the benefits of government, a flow of goodies that comes from being part of the governing coalition. This is valuable, right? So what you want to do is emphasize ethnicity, and that makes politicians emphasize the ethnic connection to the mobilization of people in their own or in related ethnic groups. So you have this kind of fragmentation of African countries as people kind of clumped together, they clubbed together by ethnic group. And even if these are fairly recent creations, they don't have to be, millennia old. They can be centuries old or a century old, right? They can be fairly recent creations. People will still gravitate to them and stick to them, and in anticipation, ordinary folks will, of receiving a kind of flow of benefits from being part of the governing coalition. Now, the problem, of course, is that when you have a politics based on this ethnicity, it's really hard to admit, that your side is lost. And losing is pretty awful. Winning is everything. It's a zero-sum game. You're not going to wait for the next election. You're going to try to get power and then keep it. After all, government isn't about solving problems. It's about getting a flow of benefits from government. Good example. In Kenya, where I've done basically some of my research is about post-election violence in Kenya, we see serious conflict in the Rift Valley. You guys have probably heard about that if you've studied anthropology or archaeology or whatever. The Rift Valley is a really important part of Africa. It's also a part of Kenya. It's an important place because the once dominant Kikuyu ethnic group settled a lot of people on land that the natives of the Rift Valley think is their own, especially the Maasai. And so during and after the recent general election in Kenya, we had this eruption of violence in the Rift Valley as the native ethnic groups kind of set upon the settler Kikuyu. And winning an election really matters because if you win the election, you've got the protection of the state. They'll protect your property interests, your interests in land, and if you lose, then the chances are the state will go do less, in effect, to defend your property interests. And then as a lonely Kikuyu settler there in the midst of all these hostile local folks, you could become a victim of violence and kind of lose your property, lose your life even. And that's kind of what we saw. I'm out of time. I have more that I'd like to talk about, but at least that much. Okay, thanks.
Okay, our respondent is Dr. William Head, who Chief Center Historian at Warner Robins Air Logistic Center and a well-known authority on U.S. policy in Asia. Dr. Head received a PhD in history from Florida State University, and he's authored more than 20 books, and you can see all the books. I'm not going to read them, all the books. In fact, all the books aren't listed there. But the latest book was Night Hunters, the history of the AC-130s and their role in U.S. air power. He was president. He's had long history of association with the Association of Third World Studies going back to the 80s. When it was founded, and he was president between 2004 and 2005. He was also head of the elections. You were talking about elections. Bill was head of the elections committee. I'm not saying that he did anything like you discussed in Africa, but anyhow, that's not an easy job. He was also president of the association 2004, 2005, and he also president of the Association of Asian Studies, Southeast Region, 2006 to 7. So that's a lot. And was U.S. Air Force Outstanding Historian Award. So please join me once again. He's been a frequent participant in our series, Dr. William Head.
Okay. And I'm also a technological dinosaur, so I don't know how to open this thing up. costume changes are supposed to be flawless. This is not one of those. There we go. Great. Now, which one do I push here? This one here? Oh. Yeah, did you hit this one? Oh. George Washington once pulled out his glasses and said he's grown old in the service of his country, but now as he I've grown blind, so hold on.
Slideshow.
Yeah, let me do it right here. Oh, here I got it right down here. There. Okay, now, these gentlemen have talked to you about Africa and South Asia. And trying to tie those two together was a great effort on my part. So instead of doing that, what I plan to do is talk about, most of y'all, we're living here in the United States. I'm going to try to tie what we are doing in regard to these two important parts of the world. And you see this compound right here? This compound is near the Pakistani Military Academy. It's in a place called, near a place called Abbottabad, Pakistan. And in the early morning hours of May the 1st is Pakistani time, 2011, a message came from this compound and was sent to the war room in the White House to President Obama and the rest of the folks there. And in the message, this coded message, which came from Navy SEAL Team 6, it simply said Geronimo E, KIA. Geronimo E is this gentleman right here, Osama bin Laden. With that message, the events of September 11th, 2001 had come full cycle. I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember, but there's one picture from 9/11. I remember that very distinctly and very clearly. And since I was on my way to the Pentagon, never got there because this is what it looked like at that time as well. Indeed, on that night on May 1st, Osama bin Laden, the mastermind of so many terror attacks and the death of tens of thousands of people, himself was at last dead. Now, the mission to kill Osama bin Laden had taken nearly a decade to work out and had been approved by President Obama only a few days before, on April the 29th. In an effort to avoid alerting everyone about what was going to take place, the president spent the early evening hours at a formal press club dinner, joking with the audience and making fun of potential presidential rivals such as Donald Trump. In the meantime, halfway around the world, the 12 members of SEAL Team 6 had crossed from their bases in Afghanistan into Pakistan. And I put this map in just so you can see where Abbottabad is, and if you can recall Chaitram's map, this is not far from that area where the terrorists are so very active. We did so, as it turns out, without the knowledge of either the Pakistani government or the Pakistani military. Now, in the process of doing this, excuse me, my papers stuck together. The SEAL Team 6 flew in under the radar, and these are actually drawings, not pictures, in Black Hawk helicopters. Now, they're not just Black Hawks, they are stealth Black Hawks, and they are painted and designed so that the radar does not pick them up. They were also supported along the border by an array of special operations aircraft and personnel, just in case. And just in case almost happened because as one of these helicopters tried to land in the courtyard, something called bad air took place. That means that in a helicopter, a rotary aircraft, it has to have a certain amount of air to lift, but for some reason it wasn't there, and it crash landed. No one was hurt, and the team continued its mission. After a brief firefight outside, they blew open the downstairs doors and quickly ascended the 3-story building. They killed 3 individuals before reaching a 3rd-floor room where 2 SEALs confronted a tall, slender subject. A woman either jumped in front of this subject or was dragged in front of her. We still don't know the truth of that. They shot her in the leg, which caused her to fall, and then shot the subject in the chest and the head. 40 minutes after they had landed, they took the body, which by now had been ID'd by photographs as bin Laden, numerous documents, and in the remaining helicopter, they departed. But before they departed, of course, they destroyed the helicopter. And you mentioned the fact that they allowed the Chinese to look at the helicopter. They didn't see much because they took within the key components of that helicopter. Eventually, the body was flown to a ship with forensic facilities for DNA testing. It was identified as Osama bin Laden. According to Islamic custom, he was not autopsied or cut up, and he was buried at sea within 24 hours. Soon after, the president made a brief statement to the nation announcing the success of the mission. And there ensued, I imagine most of you remember this, a spontaneous outpouring of joy and relief. Now, we went to Afghanistan in the first place to do just this, to kill the man who did this. And we had done that. But the thing is that it wasn't over. In fact, many of you probably read in paper, between that time and now, we've been killing other Al-Qaeda leaders, not so dramatically. In this particular case, we use unmanned aerial vehicles and drone bombs to do our work. And the war in South Asia goes on. Now, what you need to know is that war began on October the 7th, 2001, with American air attacks. And it expanded in March 2nd, 2002, when we began to provide ground support for a loose grouping of anti-Pashtun tribes known as the Northern Coalition. By that fall, and I remember this briefing so distinctly, we thought it was over. We had them beat. We had them defeated. But we didn't. Because the new president of the United States was concerned not so much with Afghanistan, but with Iraq. He told us that the leader of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, had weapons of mass destruction, which he was going to use against us. And so on March the 20th, 2003, we invaded with one of the largest armies in the history of mankind. And we got there, and we ran him out, and we took control, and it turned out there were no weapons of mass destruction. And even after President Bush declared mission accomplished, the fighting went on in both places. And we didn't leave because we decided that we would undertake a costly and protracted rebuilding of both nations. And even after Hussein was captured and executed, the fighting went on. Since that time, the very generous tax cuts, which the previous administration allowed for the wealthiest members of this society, neither of those two wars have really been funded. Neither is Medicare D. And by the end of 2007, we were beginning to creep into a recession, which you all realize we're deep in at this moment. But the economy is not the worst of this, because on the 30th of September of this year, 4,800 Americans have died in the Iraqi war, and 32,000 have been wounded. In Afghanistan, it's 2,700 killed and 14,000 wounded. And of course, Americans are still fighting and dying. And this is not to mention 300 to 500,000, depending on who you believe, Afghans and Iraqis who have also died. And at this moment, as I stand here before you, this is now America's longest war. And at least we don't forget Africa. Africa is experiencing conflict as well. Now, we talked about sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa at times seems to be such a frustrating place. As John pointed out, it has so much potential, and it is so difficult to deal with. In North Africa, of course, there have been rebellions and upheavals that have changed the government of both Libya and Egypt. And in Somalia, there's constant anarchy. And of course, as John pointed out, sub-Saharan Africa is fraught with disease, famine, pandemic, starvation, not to mention ethnic cleansing and genocide on a level per capita that would should shock everyone in this room. Well, what these presentations tonight should have told us, should have told you, if you're listening carefully, is that throughout the developing world, most people are crying out for economic and political justice. They are tired of some people having so much and some having nothing. And they are looking to the United States to show them the way. Not that they want us to come fix everything. That's a missed message if that's what we think. But you know, before we can help anybody else, we better learn how to help ourselves. Because the division of wealth in this country continues to grow. While every other industrialized country in the world has turned its wealth and effort toward providing health care, education, adequate housing, and employment opportunities for their people in their nation, this country still struggles over the question of whether the richest members of our society should pay any income tax. In this regard, the rest of the world cares very much about how we solve the issues we face. They need us to be what in the 1960s we called the shining beacon on the hill, and provide them with means to provide for themselves and work out their own problems. They are not concerned only, of course, about economic development, but democratic development. But democracy is not easy. It requires patience. It requires participation. And it requires compromise. Requires consensus, not one man or one group deciding something for us. Political freedom and economic integrity are both things we should be practicing and exporting to the rest of the world. But at least you think this is an impossible task. I want you to realize that if you in this room tonight can open your minds to the words of these two scholars and embrace the notion that we all have a stake in this planet and need to work together to make it the kind of place we all want it to be, then it will also be a place where hate mongers will not succeed, and that this thing will work. Anyway, I had a wonderful little slide of a little girl hugging a dog. And what I was trying to say was that it would be a place where a little girl can hug a dog and live in peace everywhere on the planet. Thank you.
We've got a few minutes for questions, so I'm sure there's some questions with all this information. Got to be some questions about something that's been said.
What, was Pakistan the one that just joined the UN? Just had to plea to join the UN?
No, that was the Palestinian Authority.
I'd like to add one question.
Here go one. Very good.
Oh, Gary, go on.
I guess my question would be to Dr. Singh, who told us about the sort of the troubled relationship the United States has with Pakistan. What do you think going forward? What approach should the United States take toward Pakistan? What's your prescription for how to deal with that situation?
Go ahead.
Difficult question, actually. It's easy to identify the problem. It's harder to come up with a prescription for a resolution that we would like. Here are some of the parameters. We would like to get the military out of running things in Pakistan. Because as long as they're doing that, they will play the game that they've become very adept at playing, including the kind of duplicity we've seen in the relationship between the two. And to do that, it means, at a minimum, allowing the elected government to last out its term, minimally, maximally to allow them, or to hope anyway, that they will be strong enough to subordinate the military to civilian rule, and that might not occur for some time. So we will settle for having them last out the term, which means that we're in a difficult situation. On the one hand, if you've noticed that in his testimony before Congress, the outgoing chairman of the Joint Chiefs came publicly out identifying Pakistan's duplicity and accusing them of collaborating and supporting, the ISI supporting the Haqqani network in the attack against the U.S. Embassy last month, and also in attacks against U.S. troops previously that they had not publicized. But shortly after that, you had Mrs. Clinton and others within the administration attempting to walk that back, because they're afraid that if the relationship with Pakistan becomes too estranged, that it would imperil the civilian government, and it would be a question of time when the military simply said, well, to heck with you. We were tolerating this, we tolerated the elections of 2008 to placate the United States and allow the money to keep coming in because we've been asking them for civilian rule. But if that is not going to happen, well, there's no point playing this game. We're in charge, we have been in charge, and it'll move the government aside. So there's that question at home. As long as we have, and we do have 100,000 troops in Afghanistan, they have to be supplied. And the Pakistanis do provide that kind of a service in terms of getting supplies through to Afghanistan. Of course, the Russians are also helping. So we're sort of trapped. As long as we remain in Afghanistan, we bleed. As was pointed out, we will lose more soldiers and have more injuries. It saps our budget, and if you're going to take care of matters at home, you have to bring those troops back at some point in time. The longest war here can't go on forever. It is costing us in lives and in resources, and we have to rebuild here at home. So then it comes to now, it's how do we conclude this or bring about a departure from Afghanistan? The president, when he took office, had pledged to get that done speedily as possible. But on the other hand, he said this was the most important conflict and he was going to concentrate on it. So we have a dilemma. We want to bring the troops out as quickly as possible. On the other hand, if you leave Afghanistan as a failed state, it might be only a question of time before you have to go back in. What they're trying to do is to train enough Afghans so that they can take care of their own internal affairs, which is, say, fight the insurgency and have a functioning government. And I think the estimate is that they need 400,000 troops, Afghans. So far, with NATO and us, we're providing 130,000. And so the departure date seems to be that date when they would have enough Afghans trained to where we can withdraw. So as they build up, we will reduce. But our relationship with Pakistan then is linked to our operations in Afghanistan, and it's linked to the longevity of the current elected government there. You know, it's a relationship we've now recognized. It's not one that we can trust those who are running Pakistan. We also have the dilemma of the nuclear weapons. If you look at all reporting on Pakistani military strategy, they're calculating that the United States, in concert with India and perhaps Russia, might try to quarantine those nuclear missiles. And so that's another element in the relationship there. Some would argue that we maintain troops in Afghanistan not because of the insurgency in Afghanistan, but because Pakistan is really the threat, and it puts us in close proximity to those nuclear weapons. Now, that doesn't give you a definitive answer, but it is not an easy question to answer.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. With Pakistan and Sub-Saharan Africa, the question of corruption comes up, but the corruption is deeply rooted in every South Asian society, almost everyone that's developing. So how do you address those issues? Suppose the government lashed out in Pakistan, then how do you address the issue of corruption when there's widespread corruption even in Afghanistan, India, and everywhere else?
The term corruption is not spatially located. I mean, we have corruption here
Yes.
as well. We like to look elsewhere, but there is corruption here, as you know. And John mentioned, you know, even to the level of the policemen in Africa. I experienced that. I was traveling to Accra in a taxi, and police would stop all of the vehicles there, and they have a checklist that they can check, you know, if everything is right in the vehicle. But if the taxi driver slips them some money there, you know, they just wave them off without using the checklist. So the corruption has really seeped down. It is endemic in the system. In places of Africa, you know, it's how you get things done, and I don't think you can eradicate it. Corruption is rife in Afghanistan, and I don't know that we have the capacity, and certainly not the time, to uproot it in Afghanistan. In Pakistan, you also have a lot of corruption. You've always had corruption. But I'm glad you asked the question, because even in the absence of the military doing what it is doing to constrain the civilian government, here's the problem that you have in the way politics are run in Pakistan. Political parties are sort of built around leaders. In the case of the Pakistan People's Party, it's built around Bhutto, the Bhutto family. In the case of the Pakistan Muslim League, Nawaz, same thing. It's Punjabi based. And those who invest in these parties and in running elections are like private entrepreneurs. They pump a lot of money of their own. There are no state funds. And so once in government, they believe that they should get a return on the investment they made in running for the election. And therefore, they line their pockets, which is why the current president of Pakistan, Ali Asif Ali Sardari was dubbed Mr. 10%, because when his wife was in prime minister, I mean, he was getting these kickbacks, the equivalent of about 10% of contracts, etc. I guess my answer to your question, it'll be very, very difficult for you to expunge corruption where it occurs, but primarily in these regions, because it is a currency by which business gets done. And it is sad. You could argue that in many parts of Africa, what you have is a morality in reverse. I visited a customs house in a developing country, and there was a sign. I'm sure it was meant as a joke, but I think it captures the essence of the problem. It said, honesty might be the best policy, but dishonesty leads to prosperity. So. Yes, ma'am.
Well, this young man raised a very important issue, and I have a feeling that maybe Dr. Hickman might have something to say. It seems to me your discussion of corruption in Africa was kind of tacitly tied to your comments about inequality, and I wondered if you might comment on what relationship you might see between what the UN called grotesque inequality we see around the world these days.
Yeah, I've heard comments like this before. That corruption is the grease that corruption greases the wheels of commerce, and so on. It keeps things rolling. I think at some point you've got to be careful, because you end up with nothing but grease and no wheels. It can, in fact, kind of end up with the absence of prosperity. Right? You can bleed off an awfully lot of wealth and end up with a very poor society. And I think that's what a number of sub-Saharan African countries are achieving. Chitram and I might disagree some, because I think if you look at the world as a whole, you look at the kind of the rankings of countries by Transparency International in terms of corruption, you see some impressive differences. One end of the spectrum, relatively corruption-free societies like the ones in Scandinavia. At the other end of the spectrum, countries like Equatorial Guinea. I think you just have some extremes cross-nationally, and you have extremes, say, within regions. Cape Verde or Mauritius or Botswana, relatively much cleaner than, say, again, Equatorial Guinea, Congo, or so on. So there are big differences, and those differences come from somewhere. I do know in the United States, we once had quite a reputation for bribery and corruption, and there was a moment in time when the progressive movement went after these kinds of problems, and I think, while not achieving, the absence of corruption, we certainly reduced its currency. So, for example, very few people in this society, in this room, I think, will have paid an American policeman a bribe rather than get a traffic ticket. It happens now and then, but it's pretty rare. And at one point in America, it was commonplace to bribe a policeman not to get a traffic ticket. So it's possible that you don't have to stay corrupt. Things do change over time. Although you're smiling, apparently you might remember a moment. No,
I have a get out of jail free card.
Oh, very good. I want one of those. That's good. But these things don't have to stay corrupt, and I think that's true of every society. There's no reason why Pakistan has to remain quite as corrupt as it is. And I think the impetus towards change will come from within as opposed to from without. Transparency International can just rank all it wants to, but unless people care locally and are outraged about it. And I think we see a mass movement within India itself about corruption. We've seen quite a recent upsurge of antipathy towards corrupt practices. So I guess while I'm a natural pessimist, as I said, I'm a little less pessimistic on this thing about corruption. So.
Dr. I have one.
Yeah.
For Dr. Hickman.
Yes.
How much would you attribute perhaps the inability of some of the populations in sub-Saharan Africa to rally against some of these political leaders? Would you attribute some of the things that happened in the Congo, southern Somalia, Darfur, Sierra Leone, Rwanda, where either internal or external assistance not forthcoming, people pretty much feeling like, okay, we rise up, and the world will say it's a shame.
Right.
It happened again, it should not happen, but in the process, 100,000, 200,000, in the case of Rwanda, about 1 million people
Right.
slaughtered, and the world says, well, can't
Oops.
go there.
I think it's fair. I mean, if you look at what's happened in the last 2 decades in the Great Lakes region of Africa, what you see is almost a third world war. So many deaths concentrated in this swath of countries. And for the most part, the world saying, well, if we're going to participate, maybe we could send some guns. And they have arrived. The Russian pilots fly in the AK-47s and that sort of thing, and the blood diamonds come back out. And the world has not been terribly interested in the casualties of these conflicts. That's true. I think, if you look, I'm a pessimist, but if we're looking for some hope, the fact that people are now more connected by cell phones, and it's a more urban population that you've seen in the past. Africa is urbanizing just like every place else, and it is urban populations who kind of stage these uprisings and not rural populations. So urbanization and the new social media and cell phones, something as prosaic as a cell phone, it could generate the kind of democratic, liberal upsurge eventually. Not tomorrow, not next year, but in time that we've seen in the urban. But in the past, I guess people would have good reason to think that they were more or less on their own if they attempted.
Well, who would have imagined Libya just 2 or 3 years ago? So sometimes people get fed up.
Are there any other questions? Well, please join me in thanking the speakers of the excellent seminar. Thank you for coming, and have a safe evening.